Sir, this area is restricted to personnel and invited guests only. The soup kitchen is that way. The voice cut across the November morning like a blade, sharp and deliberately loud enough for the gathered crowd to hear. Staff Sergeant Colton Mercer stood with his arms crossed over his chest, blocking the path of an old man who had wandered too close to the tactical demonstration area at Fort Bragg. The old man stopped. He leaned heavily on a hand-carved wooden cane, the oak worn smooth where his right hand gripped it. His left arm ended just below the wrist, the sleeve of his faded Army field jacket pinned back with a safety pin that had rusted from years of use. Silver stubble covered hollow cheeks, and his eyes, pale blue and distant, seemed to be looking at something far beyond the young operator standing before him. "I apologize," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, hoarse from disuse. "I was just watching." Around them, the Veterans Day ceremony had concluded an hour earlier, but families and dignitaries still milled about the base, taking photographs with soldiers, examining the equipment displays. The Delta Force tactical demonstration had drawn a considerable crowd, young operators in pristine combat gear explaining weapons systems and breaching techniques to wide-eyed children and their parents. American flags snapped in the crisp wind, and the smell of gunpowder from the earlier live fire demonstration still hung in the air. Mercer took a step closer to the old man, playing to the crowd of operators forming behind him. Several of them were grinning. A few looked uncomfortable, but said nothing. Watching, Mercer repeated, his voice dripping with theatrical disbelief. "Casing. We get your type around here all the time. Stolen valor cases looking for a handout. You probably saw the ceremony and thought you could score some sympathy from the families." The old man did not react. His spine straightened almost imperceptibly, and his weight shifted to his good leg in a way that suggested muscle memory rather than conscious thought. His remaining hand loosened on the cane, fingers spreading slightly, then curling back into position. But what Staff Sergeant Mercer did not know, what no one in that crowd could have possibly understood, was that in exactly 14 minutes he would be standing at attention, unable to speak, as the man he had just insulted received a salute from a 3-star general. A civilian family nearby began to drift away, the father pulling his children closer, the mother glancing back with sympathy in her eyes. A freelance photographer who had been documenting the Veterans Day event noticed the confrontation and raised her camera, sensing something worth capturing. "I do not want any trouble," the old man said. "I will go." But Mercer was not finished. The young operator had an audience now, and his confidence swelled with each passing moment. He gestured at the old man's disability, at the missing hand, at the limp that made every step a negotiation with pain. "Nice jacket. Let me guess, your grandfather's? Or did you buy it at the surplus store to impress people?" He pointed at the patches on the jacket, so worn and faded that the unit insignias were nearly impossible to read. "Cannot even tell what those say anymore. Probably because you made them up. They have faded." "Yes," the old man replied quietly. 30 years will do that. If you're watching this story from anywhere in the world, we would love to know where you're joining us from. Drop a comment below telling us your city or country. Stories like this one, about courage and sacrifice and hidden heroes, happen in every community. You might have a quiet legend in your own neighborhood, someone whose humble appearance hides extraordinary service. If these stories speak to you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share more incredible true stories that honor the forgotten warriors among us. Now let us continue. The morning had begun the way every morning began for Ezekiel Thornton. He woke at 0500 in the small trailer on the outskirts of Fayetteville, his body still running on military time after all these years. The prosthetic hook attachment sat on his nightstand where it always sat, and used because every time he tried to wear it, he saw the flash of the breaching charge, felt his hand vaporize, heard the screams of the men around him. He made coffee with one hand, a skill he had perfected through years of practice. He dressed in the same faded field jacket he had worn since his discharge, the patches so worn that only he knew what they once displayed. He looked at the photograph on his small table, the one he looked at every morning. Young men in unmarked uniforms, most of them now names on memorial walls. Third row, second from the right. That was him, 43 years younger, both hands intact, standing next to a colonel named Charles Beckwith who had a vision of creating the most elite special operations unit in the world. Today was Veterans Day, and Ezekiel Thornton had only one mission. Walk to Fort Bragg, visit the memorial wall, stand before the name of Sergeant First Class Darnell Washington, call sign Preacher, and tell him what he told him every single day. Still here, brother. Still trying. He had not intended to wander near the demonstration area. His leg had been bothering him more than usual, the old injury from the training accident flaring up in the cold November air, and he had stopped to rest. The sound of the tactical demonstration had drawn his attention, the familiar rhythm of operators explaining their craft, and for a moment he had forgotten himself. Forgotten that he no longer belonged to that world. Forgotten that he was just an old man with a cane now, invisible to the young soldiers who carried on the legacy he had helped build. And now Staff Sergeant Colton Mercer stood before him, demanding answers, demanding proof, demanding that he justify his presence at a place where he had once trained the trainers who trained the trainers. 30 years, Mercer laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. You're telling me you served 30 years ago in some unit, so secret the patches wore off? That is creative, I will give you that. Specialist Alejandro Reyes, standing at the edge of the operator group, noticed something the others missed. The way the old man stood, the distribution of his weight, the looseness in his remaining hand that was not relaxation but readiness. That was not some random, homeless veteran seeking sympathy. That was something else entirely. But Reyes said nothing. He was young, new to the unit, and challenging a staff sergeant in front of a crowd was not something he was prepared to do. Not yet. The photographer kept her camera raised, documenting every moment. The crowd continued to grow, and somewhere across the field, Command Sergeant Major Rufus Whitmore, 54 years old and the senior enlisted advisor for the demonstration, noticed the commotion and began walking toward it. He could not see the old man's face from this distance, could not make out the features beneath the silver stubble and the weathered skin. But something about the silhouette nagged at his memory. Something about the way the man stood despite the cane, despite the missing hand, despite everything that should have broken him. Something that whispered of ghosts and legends and men who were supposed to be dead. The confrontation had drawn more eyes now, but Ezekiel Thornton was no longer fully present. His body stood rooted to the spot, absorbing Mercer's mockery with the patience of a man who had endured far worse. But his mind had drifted backward through the decades to a time when he was whole. Fort Bragg, 1978. A colonel named Charles Beckwith stood before a group of 43 men, hands elected from Special Forces, Rangers, and other elite units across the military. They stood in an unmarked building on a corner of the base that did not officially exist, wearing uniforms stripped of all identifying patches. You are here because you are the best, Beckwith said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. But being the best is not enough. I'm going to break you down and rebuild you into something this country has never seen. Some of you will quit. Some of you will fail. The ones who remain will become the tip of the spear. We are going to be the finest counterterrorism unit on the planet, and we're going to prove it in blood. Sergeant Ezekiel Thornton, 28 years old with 2 Vietnam tours already behind him, stood in the third row. He did not know then that he would become one of the founding pillars of Delta Force. He did not know that the man standing next to him, a young operator named Darnell Washington, who everyone called Preacher because he could quote scripture while clearing a room, would become his closest friend. He did not know that Preacher would die in his arms 5 years later in a jungle that officially did not exist. All he knew was that he had finally found where he belonged. The selection process nearly killed him. Fort Emile forced marches through the Appalachian wilderness with no predetermined endpoint, no communication, no support. Psychological evaluations designed to shatter the ego. Live-fire exercises where the margin between success and death was measured in millimeters. Of the 43 men who started, 11 remained at the end. Thornton was one of them. Preacher was another. They became brothers in the truest sense of the word. They trained together, deployed together, bled together. When Thornton's father died, and he could not get leave to attend the funeral, Preacher sat with him through the night, reading passages from a worn Bible and saying nothing when Thornton finally broke down and wept. When Preacher's wife left him because she could not handle the deployments, the silence, the nightmares he would not explain, Thornton drove 8 hours to sit with him in an empty apartment and drink whiskey until the sun came up. That was what the unit did. That was what brothers did. April 1980. Operation Eagle Claw. The mission to rescue 52 American hostages held in Iran. Thornton was there when the helicopters launched from the carrier. He was there when the sandstorm hit, blinding the pilots, turning the desert into a swirling hell of noise and confusion. He was there when the helicopter collided with the C-130 transport plane, when the fireball lit up the night, when 8 American servicemen died in an instant. He moved through the smoke like a ghost, the heat searing his lungs, the screams of burning men filling his ears. He found 3 survivors trapped in the wreckage, their flesh already blistering, and he dragged them out one by one, treating their wounds with hands that would not stop shaking. 2 of them died a month later from their injuries, but 3 lived. 3 men who would have burned to death in that desert walked out because Ezekiel Thornton refused to leave them behind. They called him Iron SPECTER after that, the ghost who moved through fire and smoke and brought the living out of hell. But the name felt like a lie. 8 men died that night. The mission failed. The hostages remained in captivity for another 444 days. And Thornton carried the weight of that failure like a stone in his chest, a weight that never lifted, not even when the next mission succeeded, and the next and the next. Nicaragua, 1983. A classified operation that would never appear in any official record. The target was a Sandinista commander with ties to Soviet intelligence. The extraction was supposed to be clean. Nothing was ever clean. The ambush came from 3 directions at once. Preacher was on point, moving through the jungle with a fluid grace that made him one of the best operators Thornton had ever seen. The first round caught him in the chest, spinning him around. The second and third followed before he hit the ground. Thornton was at his side in seconds, dragging him behind cover while returning fire with his other hand. The rest of the team was scattered, pinned down, calling for support that was still 20 minutes out. Preacher looked up at him with eyes that were already fading, blood bubbling at his lips. His hand found Thornton's arm and gripped it with surprising strength. "You get them home, Zeke. Every last one." Those were his last words. 5 seconds later, his grip loosened, and Sergeant First Class Darnell Washington, call sign Preacher, was gone. Thornton did get them home. All 17 remaining members of the team. He moved through that jungle like a man possessed, flanking enemy positions, calling in coordinates, carrying wounded operators on his back when they could no longer walk. He took a round through his thigh and kept moving. He took shrapnel to his shoulder and kept moving. When the extraction helicopters finally arrived, he was the last man to board. He sat in the cargo bay with Preacher's body at his feet, staring at nothing, speaking to no one. The Silver Star citation called it extraordinary heroism. Thornton called it failure. He had missed a shooter by half a second. Half a second earlier, and Preacher would have lived. Half a second, and his best friend would have grown old, would have found another wife, would have had children who called him Dad instead of a name etched on a memorial wall. The years that followed blurred together. More operations, more medals, more names added to the wall. Thornton rose through the ranks, became an instructor, shaped the next generation of Delta operators. He was good at it, maybe the best. He poured everything he had learned, everything he had survived, into the young men who came through selection. He taught them how to shoot, how to move, how to think. But more than that, he taught them how to carry the weight, how to function when the ghosts of dead friends whispered in your ear, how to come home to a wife who did not understand and children who looked at you like a stranger. His own wife left in 1991. She said she could not reach him anymore, that he was more ghost than man, that she needed someone who was actually present. He did not argue. She was right. His children grew distant. Birthday cards went unanswered. Phone calls became shorter and less frequent. Eventually, They stopped altogether. And then came the training accident in 1994. A breaching charge malfunction. One moment he had two hands, and the next moment he was staring at a stump that ended just below his wrist, blood spraying across the concrete, the screams of the men around him mixing with his own. Medical retirement at 42. Too young to stop. Too broken to continue. The present crashed back into focus. Mercer was still talking, still mocking, but Thornton barely heard him. He was looking past the young operator, past the crowd, past the demonstration area, to the memorial wall in the distance where Preacher's name was etched in stone. Still here, brother, he thought. Still trying. But God, he was tired. Mercer closed the distance between them, his boots crunching on the gravel with the confident stride of a man who had never been proven wrong. The circle of operators behind him had grown to nearly a dozen now, some watching with amusement, others shifting their weight with visible discomfort. You know what I think, Mercer said, pitching his voice loud enough for the gathering crowd of civilians to hear. I think you're one of those guys who hangs around military bases, hoping someone will thank you for your service. Stolen valor. Pathetic. You probably found that jacket in a dumpster and thought it would get you some free meals. Thornton said nothing. His pale blue eyes remained fixed on a point somewhere beyond Mercer's shoulder, beyond the demonstration area, beyond the present moment entirely. His breathing stayed slow and controlled, the rhythm of a man who had learned long ago that reaction was a choice. A woman's voice cut through the tension. Leave him alone. It is Veterans Day, for God's sake. She was standing near the edge of the crowd, a civilian in her 50s with graying hair and a look of genuine distress on her face. Mercer turned on her with practiced authority. Ma'am, this is a security matter. This individual has no business in a restricted area. I'm going to have to ask you to step back and let us handle this. The woman hesitated, then retreated, shaking her head. But others in the crowd were growing restless. A father pulled his young son closer, murmuring something about finding the ice cream stand. An elderly man in a VFW cap watched with narrowed eyes, his jaw tight. The freelance photographer had moved closer, her camera capturing every moment. She could sense that something was building here, something that would make for more than a simple human interest piece about Veterans Day ceremonies. Specialist Reyes stood apart from the other operators, his arms crossed, his expression troubled. He had been watching the old man throughout the confrontation, and nothing about what he saw made sense. The homeless veterans he had encountered before, the ones who wandered onto bases looking for handouts or recognition, they carried themselves differently. Shoulders slumped, eyes darting, bodies shaped by defeat. This man was different. Despite the cane, despite the missing hand, despite the worn clothing and the silver stubble and the obvious poverty, he stood like someone who knew exactly where he was in space. His weight distribution was perfect, balanced on his good leg, but ready to shift in an instant. His remaining hand hung loose at his side, but the fingers were positioned in a way Reyes recognized from his own training. Relaxed but ready. The posture of a man who could move from stillness to violence in a heartbeat. Something is off, Reyes murmured to the operator standing next to him, a sergeant named Bullock. Look at how he is standing. That is not some random homeless guy. Bullock glanced at the old man and shrugged. What? You think he is special ops because he can stand up straight? My grandfather does that, and he was a cook in Korea. Reyes did not argue, but he kept watching. Mercer had returned his attention to Thornton, emboldened by the crowd's acquiescence. So here is what is going to happen. You're going to turn around, walk back the way you came, and find somewhere else to spend your Veterans Day. Maybe the VA has some leftover turkey, but you're not going to stand here pretending you belong with real soldiers. I served, Thornton said quietly. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but something in it made Mercer hesitate for just a fraction of a second. I do not pretend anything. Oh, you served. Mercer's laugh was sharp and theatrical. Let me guess. Special Forces? Delta? Maybe you were a SEAL? Come on, impress me. What unit? What years? Give me something to work with here. Across the field, Command Sergeant Major Rufus Whitmore had covered half the distance to the confrontation. He was walking faster now, something urgent in his stride. The silhouette of the old man had resolved into features as he drew closer, and those features were tugging at memories buried deep in his mind. 30 years ago, Whitmore had been a young private, fresh out of infantry training, selected for a program he did not fully understand. The instructor who had put him through the most grueling months of his life had been a master sergeant with 2 hands and no limp, but the same pale blue eyes. The same quiet voice that never rose above a conversational tone, even when he was telling you that you were about to fail. It cannot be. That man was dead. Everyone said so. Disappeared after his medical retirement, fell off the grid, probably drank himself into an early grave like so many others who could not handle the transition. But those eyes. Back at the confrontation, Mercer had grown impatient with Thornton's silence. He reached out and grabbed the old man's arm, the faded sleeve of the field jacket bunching in his grip. "You did not get to ignore me. I asked you a question. What unit?" The movement caused Thornton's sleeve to ride up, exposing weathered skin mapped with old scars. And there on the inside of his forearm, faded but unmistakable, a tattoo. Coordinates in precise numerical format. A stylized dagger pointing downward, and letters, initials perhaps, arranged in a pattern that meant nothing to Mercer. "Nice ink," Mercer said, his tone shifting to mockery once again. "Where did you get it, prison?" Thornton looked down at where Mercer's hand gripped his arm. When he looked back up, something had changed in his eyes. The distant quality was gone, replaced by a focus so intense that Mercer instinctively loosened his grip. "I got it in 1979, Thornton said. His voice was still quiet, but the softness had given way to something harder, something with edges. At a place that does not officially exist. By men who are all dead now." Mercer recovered quickly, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Oh, here we go. Secret missions. Classified operations. Let me guess, you cannot tell me, or you would have to kill me. That is original." "No." Thornton pulled his arm free slowly, not aggressively, but with a precision that made Mercer's grip feel suddenly inadequate. "I'm telling you because it does not matter anymore. Everyone who could confirm it is either dead or would not remember an old man with a cane." Whitmore was 20 meters away now, close enough to see the tattoo on the old man's forearm, close enough to recognize the coordinates, close enough to feel his heart stop in his chest. Those coordinates. He knew those coordinates. Every operator who had come through the unit in the past 40 years knew those coordinates. They were part of the legend, part of the oral history passed down from one generation to the next. The place where Iron SPECTER earned his name. His pace quickened to nearly a run, his boots pounding against the ground, his breath coming faster. The crowd parted for him instinctively, recognizing the authority in his bearing, the urgency in his movement. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice that sounded like his own 20-year-old self whispered a single word. Impossible. The weight of 40 years pressed down on Ezekiel Thornton as he stood before the young operator who still did not understand what he was looking at. The tattoo on his forearm seemed to pulse with its own heat, a permanent record of the night that had defined everything that came after. He remembered the needle. A medic named Caruso who had learned tattooing in the Philippines and offered his services to the team after operations. No official record, no paper trail, just ink and blood and brotherhood. They had all gotten them, the 11 men who survived that first selection class. Coordinates of the compound where they had trained, the dagger that represented their mission, the initials of every man who had stood beside them. 7 of those 11 were dead now. 3 had disappeared into quiet retirements, their locations unknown even to Thornton. And he was here, standing in the November cold, being mocked by a boy who had not been born when Preacher took his last breath. The memorial wall called to him. He could see it from where he stood, a dark granite slab etched with names that most people walked past without a second glance. Somewhere on that wall, 3rd row from the bottom, was the name he had come to visit. Sergeant First Class Darnell Washington. Preacher had been the best of them, not the fastest or the strongest, though he was both of those things. He was the best because he understood something that took Thornton decades to grasp. The killing was not the point. The missions were not the point. The point was bringing your brothers home. You get them home, Zeke. Every last one. Thornton had tried. God, how he had tried. After Nicaragua, he threw himself into training with a fervor that bordered on obsession. Every young operator who came through his program received the full weight of everything he had learned, everything he had survived. He taught them to shoot with precision that bordered on surgical. He taught them to move through hostile territory like shadows. He taught them to think 3 steps ahead of any enemy. But more than anything, he taught them to protect each other, to never leave a brother behind, to carry the ones who fell, even if carrying them meant carrying their memory for the rest of your life. The problem was that no one had taught him how to carry his own weight. After the accident, after the medical retirement, after his wife packed her bags and his children stopped returning his calls, the darkness came for him in ways he had not expected. He had faced enemy combatants in 12 countries. He had been shot, stabbed, burned, and broken. None of it compared to the silence of an empty house at 3 in the morning, when the ghosts of dead friends gathered in the corners and whispered accusations he could not refute. You missed the shot. Half a second. Preacher would be alive. He started drinking. Not the casual drinking of a soldier unwinding after deployment, but the desperate drinking of a man trying to drown voices that would not stop. Whiskey became his new mission, his new purpose, his new reason to wake up in the morning. The money ran out faster than he expected. Disability payments covered the basics, but the basics did not include the amount of alcohol required to silence the dead. He sold the house, then the car, then the medals one by one, to collectors who did not understand what they were buying. The Distinguished Service Cross went for $800 to a man who wanted to impress his friends. 2 silver stars brought $500 each. The Bronze Stars and Purple Hearts went in bulk to a dealer who specialized in military memorabilia. He kept only one thing: the photograph. The 11 men who had survived selection, standing in unmarked uniforms, their whole lives ahead of them. Beckwith in the center, looking like a man who knew exactly what he was building. Thornton on his right, young and whole and ignorant of what was coming. Preacher on his left, grinning that crooked grin, alive in a way that hurt to remember. The streets found him eventually. Not all at once, but in stages. A week in a motel that became a month. A shelter that became a regular stop. A bridge overpass that became home. He learned the rhythms of survival. Which soup kitchens served on which days. Which churches offered beds without requiring prayer. Which corners were safe and which belonged to men who would kill for a warm coat. He never panhandled, never begged. Something in him refused to cross that line, as if maintaining that single boundary meant he had not completely lost himself. He found day labor when he could, loading trucks or sweeping warehouses, his missing hand making most jobs difficult but not impossible. And every Veterans Day, he walked to Fort Bragg, miles on a leg that screamed with every step, hours of pain to stand before a wall and speak to a man who had been dead for 4 decades. The ritual kept him alive. He understood that now. Without Preacher's name to visit, without that annual pilgrimage, he would have let go long ago, would have found a bottle deep enough to fall into and never climb out. But he had made a promise. You get them home, Zeke. Every last one. He had failed Preacher. He would not fail his memory. The confrontation with Mercer had pulled him out of his thoughts, but standing here now, with the tattoo exposed and the young operator staring at him with a mixture of contempt and confusion, Thornton felt something shift inside him. He was tired. Tired of being invisible. Tired of being dismissed. Tired of carrying the weight alone, while boys who had never known sacrifice told him he did not belong. For 40 years, he had walked away from confrontations like this, had swallowed his pride and his history and his pain, because explaining required energy he did not have, and proving required caring about the opinions of people who would never understand. But something about today was different. Maybe it was the November cold seeping into his bones. Maybe it was the proximity to Preacher's name on that wall. Maybe it was simply that he had finally run out of patience for being treated like he was nothing by men who owed their careers to lessons he had written in blood. Mercer was still talking, demanding proof, demanding explanations, demanding that Thornton justify his existence. And for the first time in decades, Ezekiel Thornton decided that he would. Not for his own pride, never for his own pride, but for Preacher, for the man on the wall, for every broken veteran who had been dismissed and degraded and told they did not matter. He straightened his spine, feeling vertebrae pop and crack from years of poor sleep on concrete. His remaining hand tightened on the cane, not for support, but because the oak felt solid and real and present. "You want proof," he said, his voice carrying a weight it had not carried in years. "You will not like what I have to say." The crowd had swelled to nearly 50 people now, a mixture of civilians and military personnel drawn by the tension radiating from the confrontation. Parents held their children back. Young soldiers craned their necks to see over the shoulders of those in front. The photographer had positioned herself at an angle that captured both Mercer's aggressive stance and Thornton's weathered stillness. Mercer crossed his arms over his chest, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He had dealt with delusional veterans before, men who inflated their service records or invented entire careers out of movies they had watched and stories they had heard. This would be no different. The old man would spin some tale about classified missions and secret units, and Mercer would tear it apart with questions about specific dates, specific locations, specific details that no liar could fabricate on the spot. "All right," Mercer said, his voice carrying the theatrical confidence of a prosecutor about to demolish a witness. "Let's hear it. What unit? What operations? Give me something I can verify, or get off this base before I have you arrested for trespassing." Behind him, the other Delta operators had arranged themselves in a loose semicircle. Most were grinning, anticipating the entertainment of watching their staff sergeant dismantle another stolen valor case. A few, including Specialist Reyes, watched with expressions that suggested they were not entirely certain what they were about to witness. Thornton did not immediately respond. He reached into the interior pocket of his faded field jacket, moving slowly enough that his intentions were clear. His fingers found the photograph, the one he had carried for 43 years, through jungles and deserts and city streets, through marriages and divorces and the long, lonely nights under bridge overpasses. He held it out. Mercer took it with a dismissive snatch, glancing at the image without really seeing it. A bunch of men in unmarked uniforms, standing in rows before a nondescript building. He flipped it over, saw a date written in faded ink, flipped it back. What is this supposed to prove? A picture of some guys? This could be anyone. This could be from anywhere. "Third row," Thornton said. "Second from the right." "That is me." Mercer squinted at the photograph, comparing the young face in the image to the old man standing before him. There was a resemblance, perhaps, in the shape of the jaw, in the set of the eyes. But resemblance proved nothing. "So you have an old picture. Big deal. Maybe you found it. Maybe you bought it. Maybe your father was in the military, and you have been riding his coattails your whole life." The man in the center, Thornton continued, his voice steady and unhurried, is Colonel Charles Beckwith. The date on the back is November 1978. That photograph was taken the day we completed selection for the 1st Delta Force class. The words landed in the crowd like stones dropped into still water. Delta Force. The name carried weight even among civilians, conjuring images of impossible missions and legendary operators. Among the military personnel present, the reaction was more pronounced. Spines straightened, smirks faded, eyes narrowed with sudden attention. Mercer recovered quickly, forcing a laugh that sounded brittle even to his own ears. "The 1st Delta class. You expect me to believe you were in the original unit? That would make you what? 80 years old." 71, Thornton said. "I am 71. The math worked. Mercer could see it working in the faces around him. People doing the calculation, realizing that a man who was 28 in 1978 would indeed be 71 today. But math was not proof. Math was just numbers. "Anyone can claim to be part of something legendary," Mercer said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "Prove it. Give me specifics. Dates. Locations. Operations. Something that is not just a faded photograph and a good story." Command Sergeant Major Whitmore had reached the edge of the crowd. He stood frozen, unable to push through, unable to speak, staring at the old man with the cane as if he were looking at a ghost. Because he was. He was looking at a ghost. He had been 19 years old when he first met Master Sergeant Ezekiel Thornton, a young private who thought he was tough because he had survived basic training, who thought he was ready for anything because he had passed the initial screening for special operations selection. Thornton had disabused him of both notions within the first hour. The training had been brutal. Physically, mentally, emotionally brutal. Long marches with no defined endpoint. Sleep deprivation that blurred the line between reality and hallucination. Psychological pressure that cracked men like eggs and sent them home with their spirits broken. But Thornton had never raised his voice, never screamed or threatened or bullied. He simply expected excellence, and his expectation was so absolute, so unwavering, that failing to meet it felt like a personal betrayal. "You have good eyes, Whitmore," he had said once, after a particularly grueling navigation exercise. "Good eyes and a steady hand. But you hesitate. You see the target and you wait for permission to act. In the field, hesitation kills. Not just you. Your brothers. Learn to trust what you see." Whitmore had learned. He had spent the next 35 years learning, rising through the ranks, becoming one of the most respected senior enlisted leaders in the special operations community. And every step of the way, he had carried Thornton's lessons with him. The man who had taught him everything was supposed to be dead, had been dead for years, according to the rumors that circulated through the community. Drank himself to death, disappeared into the streets. A cautionary tale about what happened to operators who could not let go of the mission. But here he was, alive, broken but alive, standing before a staff sergeant who had no idea what he was looking at. Whitmore opened his mouth to speak, to push through the crowd, to end this before it went any further. But something held him back, some instinct that said the old man needed to do this himself, needed to be the one to speak the truth after so many years of silence. So he waited, and he watched, and he prayed that what came next would be worthy of the legend that had shaped his entire career. In the center of the circle, Thornton looked at Mercer with eyes that had seen more death than the young operator could imagine. "You want specifics," he said. "Very well. Let us start with April 24th, 1980. Coordinates 33.0522 north, 55.8989 east. Tabac Desert, Iran. Operation Eagle Claw." The name of the operation rippled through the crowd. Even civilians recognized it. The failed hostage rescue. The helicopters in the sandstorm. The collision. The fire. "I was there," Thornton said. "I was there when the RH-53 collided with the EC-130. I was there when 8 men burned to death in the desert. And I was there when I went into the fire and pulled 3 of them out." His voice did not waver. His eyes did not leave Mercer's face. "They call me Iron Spectre after that night, because I moved through smoke and flame like a ghost, and I brought the living out of hell." The silence that followed was so complete that Thornton could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. And somewhere at the edge of the crowd, Command Sergeant Major Rufus Whitmore whispered 2 words that changed everything. "Iron Spectre." The whispered words carried through the silent crowd like smoke, reaching ears that suddenly strained to hear more. Iron Spectre. The name meant nothing to most of the civilians present, but among the military personnel, among the operators who had grown up on stories passed down through generations of special operations soldiers, the name landed with the force of a physical blow. Mercer's face had gone pale. His arms had uncrossed, falling to his sides, as if the strength to hold them up had drained away. He stared at Thornton with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and dawning horror. "That is not possible," he said, but his voice had lost all its earlier confidence. "Iron Spectre is a legend, a training story. They tell it during selection to motivate candidates. He is not real." Thornton's gaze remained steady. "I assure you, Staff Sergeant, I am quite real, though there were many nights I wished I was not." Specialist Reyes had pushed forward through the crowd, his earlier suspicions now crystallizing into something approaching certainty. He had heard the stories. Every operator had heard the stories. The ghost who walked through fire in Iran. The shadow who single-handedly extracted a 17-man team from an ambush in Central America. The instructor who had trained more successful Delta candidates than anyone in the unit's history. But the stories always ended the same way. Iron SPECTER disappeared after a training accident in the 90s. Fell off the grid, probably dead by now. Yet here he was, broken and old and leaning on a cane, but unmistakably present. The crowd had begun to shift, the energy transforming from spectacle to something more solemn. The photographer lowered her camera slightly, sensing that what she was witnessing had moved beyond a simple confrontation into territory that demanded respect. Thornton continued speaking, his voice carrying the flat precision of an after-action report. December 1983. Coordinates 12.8654 north, 85.2072 west. Northern Nicaragua. Classified operation, no official record. We went in to eliminate a Sandinista commander with ties to Soviet intelligence. 17-man team. I was assistant team leader. He paused, and something flickered behind his eyes. Pain, old and familiar, surfacing from depths where he usually kept it buried. We were compromised on extraction, ambushed from 3 directions. My point man took 3 rounds to the chest before any of us could react. He was my best friend. His name was Darnell Washington, call sign Preacher. The name hung in the air. Some of the older military personnel in the crowd exchanged glances. Washington, that name was on the memorial wall. 3rd row from the bottom. I held him while he died, Thornton said. Took 90 seconds. Longest 90 seconds of my life. His last words were in order. You get them home, Zeke. Every last one. Thornton's remaining hand tightened on his cane, knuckles whitening with the pressure. So I did. 17 men went into that jungle. 16 came out alive. I moved through enemy positions for 6 hours, flanking, eliminating, calling in coordinates for extraction. Took a round through my thigh at hour 2. Took shrapnel to my shoulder at hour 4. Kept moving, because Preacher told me to get them home. I was not going to fail him twice. Mercer had taken a step backward, his body retreating even as his mind struggled to process what he was hearing. The level of detail was too specific to be fabricated. The coordinates, the dates, the operational terminology. This was not a delusional vagrant spinning fantasies. This was a debrief from a man who had lived through hell. The Silver Star citation called it extraordinary heroism, Thornton said. I called it the worst day of my life. Because I missed the shooter by half a second. Half a second earlier on the trigger, and Preacher would have lived. That half second has followed me for 40 years. Command Sergeant Major Whitmore had finally pushed through to the front of the crowd. He stood 10 feet from Thornton, his chest heaving, his eyes bright with moisture he refused to let fall. Sir, he said, and his voice cracked on the single syllable. Sir, it is really you. Thornton turned to look at him, and for a moment, recognition flickered across his weathered features. The shape of the face had changed, aged and hardened by decades of service, but something in the eyes remained familiar. Rufus, he said slowly. Little Rufus Whitmore. You made Command Sergeant Major. Whitmore nodded, unable to speak. He had dreamed of this moment without ever believing it would happen. Finding his old instructor, the man who had shaped everything he became, alive after all these years. You had a problem with your trigger discipline, Thornton continued, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. I made you practice dry firing until your finger bled. You complained that it was unnecessary. You told me that unnecessary practice was the difference between operators who came home and operators who came home in boxes, Whitmore said. I never forgot. I taught it to every soldier I ever trained. Good. Thornton nodded slowly. That is good. The crowd had gone absolutely still. Even the November wind seemed to have died, leaving a silence so profound that the distant sound of flags snapping on their poles carried across the field. Mercer stood paralyzed, his face a mask of dawning comprehension and growing shame. He looked at Whitmore, at the tears threatening to spill from the eyes of one of the most hardened senior NCOs in the Special Operations community, and understood that everything he thought he knew about the old man before him was catastrophically wrong. Whitmore turned to face him, and his expression had transformed from emotional to something far more dangerous. Staff Sergeant Mercer, do you understand now who you have been speaking to? Mercer opened his mouth, but no words came out. This man, Whitmore continued, his voice rising so that every person in the crowd could hear, wrote the manual you trained by. The infiltration techniques you use? His. The close quarters battle doctrine? His. The selection standards that made you an operator? His. He took a step toward Mercer, and the younger man flinched. You just accused a founding member of this unit of stolen valor. You mocked his service. You questioned his right to stand on ground that exists because of his sacrifice. And you did it in front of 50 witnesses on Veterans Day. The weight of the accusation settled over the crowd like a shroud. Civilians who had not fully understood the magnitude of what they were witnessing began to grasp it now. The photographer raised her camera again, capturing the moment when a young soldier's career began to crumble before their eyes. And somewhere at the back of the crowd, moving with purpose toward the commotion, a 3-star general had begun to take notice of the unusual gathering near the tactical demonstration area. Thornton watched the young staff sergeant's face collapse and felt no satisfaction in it. He had seen that expression before, on the faces of men who had just realized that the world was larger and more complicated than they had imagined. It was the expression of someone whose certainties had been stripped away, leaving only the raw and uncomfortable truth beneath. He could have walked away now. The point had been made. Whitmore was here, validation was complete, and Mercer's humiliation was evident to everyone present. There was nothing more to prove, but something held him in place. Not pride, never pride, something else, something that felt like unfinished business, like a debt that still needed to be paid. The memorial wall was less than 200 meters away. Preacher's name was etched into that stone, waiting for him as it waited every Veterans Day. And suddenly, Thornton understood why he had not simply turned and walked away when Mercer first confronted him. He was tired of walking away. 40 years of walking away. From confrontations, from connections, from anyone who might have helped him. He had convinced himself that isolation was strength, that carrying his burden alone was the only honorable path. But standing here now, with Whitmore's eyes bright with tears and the crowd silent with respect, he realized that he had been wrong. Preacher would have been furious with him. You get them home, Zeke. Every last one. The order had never been just about the men in Nicaragua. It had been about everyone. Every soldier Thornton trained. Every veteran he encountered on the streets. Every broken warrior who needed someone to show them that survival was possible. And it had been about himself. Preacher had known, even in those final 90 seconds, that Thornton would try to destroy himself with guilt. The order was not just a tactical directive. It was a lifeline thrown across 40 years of darkness, waiting for Thornton to finally grab hold. Rufus, he said, his voice quiet but steady, I did not come here today to cause trouble. I came to visit Preacher. That is all I wanted. Whitmore nodded, his jaw tight with emotion. I know, sir. I know. But this young man, Thornton continued, gesturing toward Mercer with his cane, he asked me a question. You want to know what gave me the right to stand here? I think he deserved a complete answer. He turned to face Mercer directly, and the staff sergeant seemed to shrink under his gaze. You see a homeless man, Thornton said. You see torn clothes and a missing hand and a limp that makes every step a negotiation with pain. You see someone who does not belong, someone who should be shuffled away, so the real soldiers can get on with their demonstration. Mercer's mouth opened, but Thornton raised his remaining hand, and the gesture carried such authority that the younger man fell silent. I understand why you see that, because that is what I am now. I am homeless. I sleep in a trailer that barely keeps out the cold. I eat at soup kitchens when my disability check runs short. I own nothing of value except a photograph and the memories that keep me company at night. The crowd listened in absolute silence. The photographer had stopped taking pictures, her camera hanging forgotten at her side. Even the wind had stilled, as if nature itself wanted to hear what came next. But I was not always this, Thornton continued. Once I was what you are, young, strong, certain that my training and my skills made me invincible. I stood where you stand, looking at older men with pity or contempt, never imagining that one day I would become them. He took a step closer to Mercer, his cane tapping against the ground with each movement. I have killed men in 7 countries. I have watched friends die in my arms and kept fighting because the mission demanded it. I have made decisions in seconds that ended lives and saved others, and I have carried the weight of those decisions for decades. I have been shot, stabbed, burned, and broken. I have lost my hand, my family, my home, and very nearly my mind. His voice dropped lower, intimate, as if he were speaking only to Mercer despite the dozens of witnesses hanging on every word. And through all of it, I never once questioned another veteran's service based on how they looked. Because I learned, a long time ago, that the men who have seen the worst often carry it the quietest. The loudest voices in the room are rarely the ones with the most to say. Mercer's eyes had dropped to the ground. His shoulders had curved inward, his whole body language radiating shame. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. I did not know. I could not have known. No, Thornton agreed. You could not. And that is exactly the point. He turned away from Mercer, facing the crowd that had gathered around them. Families with children, veterans in VFW caps, young soldiers in uniform, civilians who had stumbled upon something they did not fully understand but recognized as significant. Every veteran you see on these streets, Thornton said, raising his voice so that it carried to the edges of the assembly. Every man or woman who looks broken, who smells of alcohol, or wears clothes that have not been washed in weeks. Remember that they might have carried a weight you will never understand. They might have done things that saved lives, that protected this country, that allowed you to stand here today in safety. He paused, letting the words settle. Do not judge them by their appearance. Do not assume you know their story. Do not mock what you do not understand. Because the man you dismiss as worthless might be the reason you are alive to dismiss anyone at all. The silence that followed was not the awkward silence of discomfort. It was the heavy silence of people absorbing something important, something that would stay with them long after this day ended. Whitmore stepped forward, his composure partially restored. Sir, the unit would like to honor you. Today. Now, will you let us? Thornton looked at him for a long moment. The offer was genuine, he could see that. Whitmore wanted to give him recognition, to restore some measure of the dignity that had been stripped away by years of poverty and neglect. But dignity was not something that could be given. It could only be claimed. I do not need honor, Rufus, he said finally. I never did. He turned and began walking toward the memorial wall, his cane tapping against the ground, his limp pronounced, but his spine straight. But I don't need to finish what I came here to do. I need to visit a friend. And no one tried to stop him. The crowd parted before him like water around a stone. Families stepped aside, pulling their children close not from fear, but from instinctive respect. Veterans in their ceremonial caps removed their headgear and held it against their chests. Young soldiers snapped to attention without being ordered, their training overriding any uncertainty about protocol. Thornton walked through them all without acknowledgement, his eyes fixed on the memorial wall in the distance. Each step sent pain radiating up through his damaged leg, but he had long ago learned to treat pain as background noise, something to be noted and then ignored. The cane tapped its steady rhythm against the ground, marking time like a metronome, counting down to something inevitable. Behind him, the crowd did not disperse. Instead, they began to follow at a respectful distance, drawn by the gravity of the moment. Whitmore walked closest, his face a mask of controlled emotion. Specialist Reyes fell in his step beside him, still processing what he had witnessed. Even Mercer, pale and shaken, found himself moving with the rest, unable to look away from what was unfolding. The photographer documented it all. The procession of a broken warrior returning to hallowed ground, trailed by the community that had finally recognized him. She knew, with the instinct that separated great journalists from merely competent ones, that these images would matter, that they would speak to something larger than a single confrontation on a November morning. Lieutenant General Marcus Holloway had been observing from a distance, alerted by an aide who recognized that something unusual was happening near the tactical demonstration area. He was a tall man, silver-haired and square-jawed, with the bearing of someone who had spent 40 years in uniform and intended to spend his final years ensuring that service meant something. He intercepted Whitmore as the procession moved toward the memorial. "Command Sergeant Major. Report." Whitmore's voice was tight but controlled. "Sir, that man is Sergeant Major Ezekiel Thornton, retired. Call sign Iron Spectre. Founding member of the unit." Holloway's stride faltered for just a moment before he recovered. He studied the old man walking ahead of them. The faded jacket, the cane, the missing hand, the shape of the shoulders, the way he moved despite the limp, each step deliberate and precise. "I know who he is," Holloway said quietly. "I was a captain in 1986. He ran my selection class. He's the reason I am standing here." The general quickened his pace, moving past Whitmore to catch up with Thornton. He fell in a step beside the older man, matching the slower rhythm without comment. "Sergeant Major," he said. Thornton glanced sideways, taking in the 3 stars on Holloway's collar, the ribbons on his chest, the face that had aged but remained familiar. "You were the captain who cried on day 3 of selection," he said. "I told you crying was fine as long as you kept moving." Holloway actually smiled, a brief expression that softened the hard lines of his face. "I kept moving, all the way to this." Thornton nodded slowly. "Good. That is good." They walked in silence for a moment, the memorial wall growing closer with each step. The names etched into the granite were becoming visible now, row upon row of men who had given everything. "I heard you were dead," Holloway said. "Rumors circulated for years. Drank himself to death. Disappeared into the streets. I should have looked harder. You had a command to run, wars to fight. I did not want to be found. And now?" Thornton considered the question. The wall was 50 meters away. Preacher's name waited for him, patient as it had been for 40 years. "Now I'm tired of hiding," he said. "Tired of pretending that surviving is the same as living. A young staff sergeant reminded me today that I still have something to prove. Not to him, to myself." Holloway nodded, understanding more than the words conveyed. "What happened back there?" "My aide said there was a confrontation. Staff Sergeant Mercer did not believe I was who I claimed to be. He accused me of stolen valor, demanded proof, and you provided it. In detail." Thornton's voice carried a note of something that might have been dark humor. He was not prepared for details. Holloway's expression hardened. "I will deal with Mercer." "No." Thornton stopped walking, turning to face the general directly. The crowd behind them halted as well, maintaining their respectful distance. The boy made an assumption based on what he saw. He was wrong, but he was not malicious. He was trying to protect the integrity of the unit. "He disrespected you. On Veterans Day, in front of witnesses. He disrespected a homeless man who wandered into a restricted area." Thornton shook his head slowly. "I have been that homeless man for a long time, General. I know what I look like. I know what assumptions people make. Being angry at Mercer for making those assumptions would be like being angry at the sun for rising." Holloway studied him for a long moment. "You have changed. The man I remember would have taken Mercer apart. The man you remember had 2 hands and a future." Thornton raised his left arm slightly, the pin sleeve a stark reminder of what he had lost. "I have had a long time to learn that anger accomplishes nothing. The only thing that matters is what comes next." "And what comes next for you?" Thornton turned back toward the memorial wall. Preacher's name was visible now, 3rd row from the bottom, the letters sharp and clear against the polished granite. "Right now, I'm going to talk to my friend. After that, I do not know, but I think I might be ready to stop running." Holloway nodded. "Then let me walk with you, if you will allow it." Thornton looked at the general, at the 3 stars that represented a lifetime of service and sacrifice. Then he looked at Whitmore, who had caught up and stood waiting. At Reyes, whose young face showed the kind of dawning understanding that Thornton remembered from his own youth. At the crowd that had gathered, civilians and soldiers alike, all of them witnessing something they would carry with them for years to come. Preacher would have appreciated the company, he said finally. He always said that the hardest battles are the ones we fight alone. He never approved of how much time I spent doing exactly that. "Then let us honor his wisdom," Holloway said. They walked the final 50 meters together, the general and the ghost, trailed by a procession that had grown to nearly 100 people. The November sun broke through the clouds as they approached the wall, casting long shadows across the names of the fallen. And Staff Sergeant Colton Mercer, standing at the back of the crowd with tears streaming down his face, began to understand that this day would change him forever. The memorial wall rose before them, a slab of polished black granite that absorbed the November light and held it captive. Names stretched across its surface in neat rows, hundreds of them, each one representing a life given in service to a country that would never fully know what had been sacrificed on its behalf. Thornton stopped at the base of the wall, his cane pressing into the soft earth. The procession behind him halted as well, spreading out in a loose semicircle that maintained a respectful distance. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the children in the crowd seemed to sense that this moment required silence. Holloway stood to Thornton's right, Whitmore to his left. They flanked him like an honor guard, though no orders had been given and no protocol demanded their positions. It simply felt correct, two men who owed their careers to the broken warrior between them, standing witness to his private pilgrimage. Thornton's eyes moved across the names until they found the one he sought. Third row from the bottom, seventh name from the left. Sergeant First Class Darnell Washington. The letters were sharp and clean, maintained by groundskeepers who understood that this wall was sacred ground. 40 years of weather had not faded them. 40 years of visitors had not worn them smooth. They remained as permanent as the sacrifice they commemorated. Thornton reached out with his remaining hand and pressed his fingers against the granite. The stone was cold beneath his touch, cold as the jungle floor where Preacher had bled out, cold as the nights Thornton had spent under bridges wondering why he had survived when better men had not. "Hey, brother," he said softly. His voice was barely above a whisper, meant only for the name beneath his fingers, but in the profound silence of the gathered crowd, every word carried. "I'm sorry I'm late this year. Got held up on the way." He paused, as if listening for a response that would never come. "I met some of the new generation today. They are good, strong, well-trained. You would be proud of what the unit has become." Whitmore made command sergeant major. Remember him? The skinny kid with the bad trigger discipline? He turned out all right. Behind him, Whitmore's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. His eyes were fixed on the old man's back, on the faded jacket that had once displayed patches worn with pride, on the shoulders that had carried so many burdens for so long. "I also met a young staff sergeant who reminded me of us," Thornton continued. "Confident. Maybe too confident. He made some mistakes today, said some things he should not have said. But I think he learned something. I think he will be better because of it." The crowd listened, transfixed. What had begun as a confrontation had transformed into something far more profound. They were witnessing a conversation between the living and the dead, a ritual of remembrance that transcended the boundaries of time and mortality. "I've been thinking about what you told me," Thornton said. "That last day. You get them home, Zeke. Every last one. I tried, brother. God, I tried. 300 operators through my program. More if you count the ones they trained. Some of them made it home. Some did not. That is the math we live with." His voice caught slightly, a tremor of emotion breaking through decades of control. "But never got myself home, did I? I have been wandering for 30 years, Preacher, sleeping in places you would not believe, eating food you would not touch, telling myself that I deserved it because I missed that shot, because I was half a second too slow, because you died and I did not." The fingers pressed against the granite curled slightly, as if trying to grip the stone, to hold on to something solid in a world that had become increasingly ephemeral. "I think I was wrong about that. I think I've been wrong for a long time. You did not order me to punish myself. You ordered me to get them home. All of them. And I cannot do that if I'm hiding under bridges feeling sorry for myself." He straightened slightly, his spine finding alignment it had not held in years. "There's a general here. Holloway. I trained him back in '86. He wants to help me. There's a whole crowd of people here, actually. Soldiers. Civilians. Families. They all followed me to the wall. Can you believe that? After everything, after all the years of being invisible, they followed me." A bitter laugh escaped his lips, quiet and self-deprecating. You always said I was too stubborn to accept help. Said that asking for help was not weakness, it was wisdom. I told you that I did not need anyone, that I could carry my own weight. You just smiled that smile of yours and said I would figure it out eventually. He lowered his head, his forehead nearly touching the cold granite. I think eventually might finally be here, brother. I think I might be ready to come home. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind had stilled, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Then Thornton felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find Whitmore standing beside him, no longer maintaining the respectful distance. His face wet with tears he no longer tried to hide. "Sir," Whitmore said, his voice rough with emotion. "Preacher was right. Asking for help is not weakness, and you do not have to carry this alone anymore." On his other side, Holloway stepped forward as well. "The unit takes care of its own, Sergeant Major. We should have found you years ago. We failed in that. But we are here now, and we are not going anywhere." Thornton looked from one man to the other. The general with his 3 stars and his decades of command. The command sergeant major with his hard-earned wisdom and his unshakable loyalty. 2 men who represented everything he had helped build, reaching out to pull him back from the edge of an abyss he had been circling for 30 years. Behind them, the crowd waited in silence. Specialist Reyes stood with his hands clasped in front of him, learning a lesson about brotherhood that no training program could teach. The photographer had lowered her camera entirely, unwilling to intrude on something this sacred. And Staff Sergeant Mercer had fallen to his knees on the grass, his head bowed, his body shaking with silent sobs. Thornton turned back to the wall one final time. His fingers traced Preacher's name, each letter a promise, a prayer, a farewell. "I have to go now, brother," he whispered, "but I will be back. And next time, I think I might actually have something good to report." He stepped back from the wall, straightening to his full height despite the pain in his leg and the ache in his heart. "All right," he said, addressing Holloway and Whitmore. "I am ready. Tell me about these programs you mentioned." The transformation was immediate and profound. Holloway turned to face the assembled crowd, his command presence radiating outward like a physical force. The civilians and military personnel alike straightened instinctively, recognizing authority when they saw it. "What you are witnessing today," Holloway said, his voice carrying across the memorial grounds, "is what happens when we forget, when we see the surface and not the substance, when we allow assumptions to blind us to the truth standing right in front of us." He gestured toward Thornton, who stood quietly beside the wall, his hand still resting near Preacher's name. This man bled for this country while most of us were learning to walk. He trained the trainers who trained the trainers. He built the foundation upon which our entire special operations community stands. And he has been living on our streets, invisible to the institution he helped create, because we failed to look for him. The words landed with devastating weight. Military personnel in the crowd exchanged uncomfortable glances, recognizing the institutional failure that Holloway was naming. Civilians who had never served felt the shame by proxy, understanding that this was not just a military problem, but a societal one. Holloway turned to his aide, a young major who had been hovering at the edge of the crowd. "Give me Colonel Vance from Special Operations Command, and contact the Veterans Affairs Liaison on base. I want a full briefing on every reintegration program we have access to within the hour." The aide saluted and disappeared, already pulling out his phone. Whitmore stepped forward, addressing the military personnel in the crowd. "Formation. Now." The response was instantaneous. Delta operators, rangers, support personnel, anyone in uniform moved into position, forming ranks with the precision of men and women who had spent their lives mastering the art of organized movement. Within 30 seconds, nearly 40 soldiers stood at attention in neat rows before the memorial wall. Thornton watched with an expression that mixed bewilderment with something deeper, something that looked almost like hope. He had not expected this, had not expected any of this. He had come to visit a name on a wall and found himself standing at the center of something far larger than his private grief. Holloway moved to stand before the formation, then turned to face Thornton. "Sergeant Major Ezekiel Thornton," he said formally, his voice carrying the weight of official ceremony. "Call sign Iron Spectre. On behalf of the United States Army Special Operations Command, I offer you our profound gratitude for your decades of service. Your sacrifice built the foundation upon which we all stand. Your training saved countless lives. Your example continues to inspire every operator who wears the patch you helped design." He paused, allowing the words to settle. "I also offer you our deepest apology. We should have found you. We should have ensured that you never wanted for anything. The fact that a founding member of this community has been living in poverty while we prospered is a failure we must own and correct." Thornton opened his mouth to protest, to say that no apology was necessary, that he had chosen his path and accepted its consequences. But Holloway raised his hand, forestalling any objection. "I'm not finished, Sergeant Major." He turned to the formation. "Present arms." 40 hands snapped to foreheads in perfect unison, saluting not a rank but a legacy. The sound of the synchronized movement echoed across the memorial grounds like a thunderclap. Thornton stood frozen. His remaining hand trembled at his side, decades of military conditioning warring with decades of believing he deserved nothing. The salute was not symbolic. It was not ceremonial. It was 40 soldiers acknowledging that the broken man before them had earned their respect through sacrifice they could barely comprehend. Slowly, fighting against every instinct that told him he was unworthy, Thornton raised his right hand to his forehead. The return salute was imperfect, executed by a man who had not performed the gesture in 30 years, but carried more weight than any parade ground demonstration ever could. "Order arms," Holloway commanded. The formation lowered their salutes as one. At ease, the soldiers relaxed into parade rest, but their eyes remained fixed on Thornton. Specialist Reyes stood in the front row, his face showing the kind of reverent attention usually reserved for Medal of Honor recipients. Beside him, operators who had spent their careers chasing legends now found themselves standing before one. Whitmore approached Thornton, his voice low enough that only those closest could hear. "Sir, the unit has a reintegration program for veterans in crisis. It is not the VA. No bureaucracy. No paperwork. Just operators helping operators. Housing, medical care, counseling. Whatever you need." "I do not need charity," Thornton said automatically, the words emerging from years of habit. "It is not charity," Whitmore replied firmly. "It is debt repayment. Every man and woman in that formation owes their career to what you built. Every operator who came home alive did so because of techniques you developed, standards you established, training you perfected. Accepting our help is not taking something you did not earn. It is allowing us to honor an obligation we have owed for decades." Thornton looked at the formation, at the faces watching him with respect he had long ago stopped believing he deserved. He thought of Preacher, of the order that had defined his existence for 40 years. "You get them home, Zeke. Every last one. Maybe it was time to let someone get him home." "All right," he said finally. His voice cracked slightly on the word, emotion breaking through the walls he had maintained for so long. "All right, I will try." The response from the formation was immediate, a sound that started as a murmur and built into something approaching a roar. Not cheering exactly, but affirmation, recognition. "Welcome." Holloway smiled, the expression transforming his stern features. "Good, because I have one more thing to address before we proceed." He turned toward the back of the crowd, where Staff Sergeant Mercer still knelt on the grass, his face buried in his hands. Staff Sergeant Mercer, front and center. The crowd parted to reveal the young operator. He rose unsteadily to his feet, wiping his face with the back of his hand, and walked forward on legs that seemed barely able to support him. He stopped before Holloway and snapped to attention, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the general's shoulder. "Sir, Staff Sergeant Mercer reporting as ordered." Holloway studied him for a long moment, letting the silence stretch. "You made a serious error in judgment today, Staff Sergeant. You accused a founding member of this unit of stolen valor. You mocked his service. You questioned his right to stand on ground that exists because of his sacrifice. Mercer's jaw tightened, but he did not break attention. Yes, sir. No excuse, sir. You are correct. There is no excuse. Holloway paused, glancing at Thornton. However, Sergeant Major Thornton has requested that I not pursue disciplinary action against you. He believes that you acted from misguided protectiveness of a unit rather than malice. He believes you can learn from this experience and become a better soldier because of it. Mercer's eyes flickered toward Thornton, disbelief and gratitude warring on his face. Do you agree with his assessment, Staff Sergeant? Can you learn from this? Yes, sir. Mercer's voice was hoarse but steady. I will spend the rest of my career learning from this. Good. Holloway nodded. Then your first lesson begins now. You will personally escort Sergeant Major Thornton to the reintegration facility. You will ensure he has everything he needs, and you will listen to whatever he chooses to tell you about what real service looks like. Mercer swallowed hard. Yes, sir. It would be an honor, sir. He turned to Thornton and executed the sharpest salute of his career. Sergeant Major, I am sorry. I was wrong, and I am ready to learn. Thornton looked at him for a long moment, seeing past the shame and the fear to the young soldier underneath, the one who had made a mistake and was now being given the chance to grow from it. Then let us begin, he said. The formation dispersed slowly, soldiers breaking ranks to approach Thornton one by one. Each interaction followed the same pattern. A salute, held with rigid precision. A few words of gratitude or respect. A handshake that lingered longer than protocol demanded. Thornton accepted each gesture with quiet dignity, though the experience clearly overwhelmed him. His eyes grew brighter with each encounter, moisture gathering that he refused to let fall. 40 years of isolation had conditioned him to expect nothing from others. The sudden flood of recognition and respect threatened to breach walls he had spent decades constructing. Specialist Reyes was among the last to approach. He stopped before Thornton and saluted, but when he lowered his hand, he did not immediately step away. Sergeant Major, he said, his voice carrying the earnest intensity of youth. I noticed something was wrong from the beginning. The way you stood, the way you held yourself. I knew you were not what Staff Sergeant Mercer thought you were. Thornton studied the young operator, and yet you said nothing. No, sir. Reyes dropped his gaze, shame coloring his features. I should have. I was too concerned about challenging a superior. I will not make that mistake again. Good. Thornton nodded slowly. You have good eyes, Reyes. That is the first thing. The second thing is acting on what you see. I told someone else those same words once a long time ago. He learned the lesson. So will you. Reyes looked up, something shifting in his expression. May I ask who, sir? Thornton glanced toward Whitmore, who stood nearby coordinating logistics with Holloway's aide. Him, when he was about your age. Just as uncertain, just as capable. Reyes followed his gaze, then turned back to Thornton with new understanding. He became Command Sergeant Major. He became someone who acts on what he sees. The rank was just a consequence. The photographer had been documenting everything, capturing images that would define this Veterans Day for years to come. She approached now, camera lowered, her professional demeanor softened by what she had witnessed. Sergeant Major, she said, my name is Elena Vasquez. I'm a freelance journalist. I have been photographing military ceremonies for 15 years, and I have never seen anything like what happened here today. Thornton regarded her with the wariness of a man who had spent decades avoiding attention. What do you intend to do with those photographs? With your permission, I would like to tell this story. Not for sensationalism, not for clicks or controversy, but because people need to see this. They need to understand what happens when we forget our veterans. And they need to see what happens when we remember. Thornton considered her words. The instinct to refuse was strong, born from years of believing that his story did not matter, that his suffering was deserved, that visibility would only bring pain. But something had shifted inside him at the memorial wall. A door had opened that he could not close again. Tell it truthfully, he said finally. That is all I ask. Do not make me a hero. I am not a hero. I'm just a man who served and then got lost for a while. Vasquez nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I will tell it truthfully. I promise." The logistics of Thornton's transition moved with military efficiency. Within an hour, a vehicle had been arranged to transport him to the reintegration facility. His meager possessions of the trailer in Fayetteville would be collected and brought to him. Medical evaluations were scheduled. Housing was confirmed. Mercer handled every detail personally, his earlier arrogance replaced by a focused determination to make things right. He spoke to Thornton with deference, but not servility, treating him as what he was, a superior who had earned respect through decades of sacrifice. "Sir, the vehicle is ready," Mercer reported. "I will be driving you myself. Command Sergeant Major Whitmore will meet us at the facility." Thornton nodded, but before moving toward the vehicle, he turned back to the memorial wall. Preacher's name was visible from where he stood, the letters catching the afternoon light. "One moment," he said. He walked back to the wall alone, the crowd parting once again to let him pass. He pressed his hand against the granite one final time, his lips moving in words too soft for anyone else to hear. "I told you I would be back with something good to report, brother. Turns out I did not have to wait. They found me. After all these years, they found me. I think I'm finally going home." He stood there for a long moment, communing with the dead, drawing strength from the memory of a man who had believed in him even when he could not believe in himself. Then he turned and walked toward the waiting vehicle. The crowd had not dispersed. If anything, it had grown as word spread across the base about what had transpired at the memorial. Soldiers and civilians lined the path from the wall to the parking area, forming an impromptu corridor of honor. As Thornton walked between them, something remarkable began to happen. One by one, people started to applaud. Not the polite, scattered applause of a formal ceremony, but something deeper and more sustained. A rolling thunder of recognition that built and built until it filled the November air like a living thing. Thornton walked through the sound with his spine straight and his eyes forward, the cane tapping its steady rhythm against the pavement. Tears finally escaped his control, tracking down his weathered cheeks, but he did not wipe them away. He let them fall, acknowledging for the first time in decades that he was allowed to feel something other than guilt and shame. Holloway waited at the vehicle, standing at attention. As Thornton approached, he rendered a final salute. "Welcome home, Sergeant Major," he said. "It has been a long time coming." Thornton returned the salute, his hand steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "Yes," he said, "it has." He climbed into the vehicle, Mercer holding the door with the care of a man handling something precious. Through the window, he could see the crowd still watching, still applauding, still bearing witness to a moment that none of them would ever forget. The engine started. The vehicle began to move. And Ezekiel Thornton, call sign Iron SPECTER, finally began the journey home. 6 months later, the morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of the Special Operations Reintegration Center as Ezekiel Thornton walked the familiar path from his small apartment to the main building. His limp was still there, would always be there, but it seemed less pronounced now. Regular meals, proper medical care, and something resembling purpose had restored a vitality that decades on the streets had stripped away. He no longer carried the hand-carved cane. A proper prosthetic hand had replaced the hook he had refused to wear, fitted by specialists who understood that function mattered more than appearance. He was still learning to use it, the movements awkward and imprecise, but he practiced every day with the same discipline he had once applied to marksmanship and close-quarters combat. The faded field jacket had been retired, replaced by clean clothes that fit properly. But the photograph remained in his pocket, transferred from one garment to the next, a constant companion that would stay with him until the end. The main building housed a classroom where twice a week, Thornton sat with groups of veterans who were struggling to find their way back from the darkness. Some had lost limbs. Some had lost minds. All had lost something essential, some piece of themselves left behind in deserts or jungles or mountains half a world away. He did not lecture them, did not tell war stories or dispense wisdom from on high. He simply sat with them and listened, and when they were ready, he shared pieces of his own journey. "I was you," he would say. "I lived in a car until the engine died. Then I lived under a bridge. Then I lived nowhere at all, just moving from one place to the next, trying to stay ahead of the memories. I hated myself for surviving when better men did not. I believed I deserved every cold night, every empty stomach, every moment of suffering. The veterans would listen, recognizing their own pain in his words. But I was wrong. He would continue. Punishing ourselves does not honor the dead. It just adds our names to the list of casualties, even if our hearts keep beating. The men we lost, they did not die so we could destroy ourselves with guilt. They died so we could live. And living means more than just breathing. Some of them hurt him. Some of them were not ready yet. But the door stayed open, just as Whitmore had promised, and Thornton was always there when they were ready to walk through it. The video from Veterans Day had spread across the internet like wildfire. Elena Vasquez had kept her promise, telling the story truthfully, without sensationalism or exploitation. The images of Thornton standing before the memorial wall, of the formation saluting, of Staff Sergeant Mercer on his knees with tears streaming down his face, had been viewed millions of times. The response had been overwhelming. Donations poured into veteran support organizations. Politicians who had ignored veteran homelessness for years suddenly found their voices. Legislation that had languished in committee was pushed forward. The story of Iron Spectre became a catalyst for change that extended far beyond one man's redemption. Mercer had become a different person entirely. He visited the Reintegration Center monthly, spending time with veterans, listening to their stories, learning the lessons that Thornton had promised to teach him. He had started a program within the unit, pairing young operators with older veterans for mentorship and connection. He never forgot what his assumptions had almost cost, and he was determined to ensure that no one else made the same mistake. Whitmore remained a constant presence in Thornton's life. They met for coffee every Saturday morning, two old soldiers talking about everything and nothing, rebuilding a connection that had been severed by decades and circumstance. Sometimes they laughed. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence. Sometimes Whitmore asked questions about the old days, and Thornton found himself sharing stories he had locked away for 40 years. Specialist Reyes had been promoted to sergeant, his career trajectory accelerated by a newfound confidence in acting on what he saw. He wrote to Thornton occasionally, updating him on missions he could not discuss in detail, asking advice on leadership challenges he was navigating. Thornton always wrote back, his words sparse, but meaningful, the correspondence of men who understood each other without needing to explain. And every Veterans Day, Thornton returned to the memorial wall. He stood before Preacher's name as the November wind cut across the granite, as it had for 41 years now. But this time he was not alone. Whitmore stood beside him. Mercer stood behind him. A group of veterans from the reintegration program had made the journey as well, standing at respectful distance, honoring the ritual that their mentor had maintained for 4 decades. "Hey, brother," Thornton said softly, his new prosthetic hand pressed against the cold stone. "I brought some friends this year. Hope you do not mind the company." He paused, listening to the wind, imagining the response Preacher might have given. "The program is doing well. 14 men reintegrated this year. Jobs, housing, families reconnected. 3 of them are going back to school. One of them is going to be a counselor himself, if you can believe it. Paying it forward, just like you would have wanted." His voice grew quieter, more intimate. "I still miss you every day. That will never change. But I think I finally understand what you were trying to tell me. Getting them home was never just about the mission. It was about all of it. Every veteran who needs a hand. Every soldier who is lost in the darkness. Every brother and sister who forgot that they matter." He stepped back from the wall, straightening his spine, feeling the November sun on his face. "I'm still here, Preacher, still trying. And I think, finally, I am actually living." He turned to face the group that had gathered behind him. Veterans with haunted eyes and uncertain futures. Young soldiers who wanted to understand. Old friends who had found him after decades of searching. "All right," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had never truly left him. "Who wants to hear about the man whose name is on this wall?" Because Sergeant First Class Darnell Washington, call sign Preacher, was the best operator I ever knew, and his story deserves to be told. The group gathered closer, forming a circle around the old warrior and the name etched in stone. And as Thornton began to speak, sharing memories he had guarded for 40 years, the November wind carried his words across the memorial grounds like a prayer. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that second chances are possible and that heroes walk among us every day wearing faces we do not recognize, please subscribe to our channel. And share in the comments who is the quiet warrior in your life who deserves recognition. Sometimes the greatest strength is not the ability to fight, but the courage to keep standing when everything is trying to knock you down. The man you pass on the street, the woman sitting alone in the coffee shop, the veteran who does not talk about what they have seen, they all have stories. Some of them might just be legendary. Thank you for watching.